books excite you? I just think books are wonderful. I love to work in a room that's filled with books because I see them as friends who sit on the shelf. You bring them down, they challenge you, they excite you, they correct you. We're looking at the book, probably of all books, when we look at the Bible. Because let's not forget, on the one hand, this is the Word of God. It's a divine revelation. It's something breathed out by God. He takes the initiative. Yet at the same time, it's also human language, human grammar as well. Because, well, we find Ecclesiastes, he reflects on choosing words. Some words are like goads that prod you. Other words are like nails you hang on. Then you come to the book of Luke, who says, as a historian, I've chosen carefully what I'm going to write about. And John tells us, I've had to edit stuff because, listen, if I wrote everything, there'd be too much. So, as we approach this book, let's bring the best of our human minds and, in a sense, bring it under our judgment. We'll study it to know it. But to really understand it, we've got to then submit ourselves to its judgment, because it is God's Word. So we're coming to look at this book, and we've come to a point now in our studies where we're slowing down yet again, and I'm going to take you today out into the wilderness. So I hope you have a sun hat, and I hope you have plenty of water, because it gets very, very hot out here. And we're going to spend a while looking in some depth. Because remember last time we were out in the wilderness, we were really in, well, you might call it the marital home, where God was in the midst of his people. And in that marital home, we called the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, Ohel Moed. Here we discovered this intimacy between God and his people. Now, I want us to spend some time here today, because sometimes we learn not just from books, but we learn from things. And God himself, you see, I honestly believe, is a masterly, absolutely masterly teacher, masterly pedagogue. And he would have them learn by what they would eat, by what they would wear, and also where they would gather. This building became so important. So you and I, as it were, we're coming to, well, to sit with our father for a little while. Do you know what it was? You remember what it was like snuggling up to grandfather who would read wonderful stories? Well, here we're coming to listen as God teaches us, and it's as if he's saying to us, I've got a lot to teach you through this particular revelation, through this particular building. So let's spend time. It's as if, without in any way being kind of disrespectful, we're being invited into God's kindergarten. Now, the lovely thing about kindergarten, you touch, you smell, you see. Never ever disregard your senses when it comes to the things of God, because he's the one who made us. And here's a place, oh, listen, it's full of sights and sounds. Now, what we're going to discover, when we're in Leviticus, you're in kindergarten. Now, by the time you get way deep into the New Testament, you're doing postgraduate studies now, but God doesn't contradict the fundamental lessons he learned, or he taught his people way back in kindergarten. I have a friend, he's a very, very humble Christian man, but he's a professor of maths. And I often, when I saw him walking up past the university with his little briefcase, I thought, now, Alan, probably like many of us, you learned with blocks, a yellow block, a red block, green block, like 2 and 2 made 4. You built your blocks and you learned mathematical principles. And I've often looked at this little briefcase and I thought, do you still have your blocks in there? Doing postgraduate research and mathematics, I think he's left his blocks behind. But the fundamental lessons he was taught back in kindergarten, he never threw out. So that's why we need to be very, very, very careful when you're reading the Bible as a whole, that you don't get to the New Testament and then throw out, discard things that have gone before, because they are fundamental building blocks, particularly as we'll come to see the New Testament book of Hebrews. It's towards the end of the New Testament. But if you're going to understand Hebrews, listen, you need to get your sun hat and your water bottle, because you need to come right back out into the wilderness again. Because the whole of Jesus' ministry, the whole of what he came to do is interpreted. Do you remember last time we saw he was interpreted through the lens of the new Exodus, a greater than Moses figure? Well, in the book of Hebrews, he's going to be interpreted through, this building actually. Because he's the ultimate high priest. He's the ultimate dwelling of God among people. So what are we going to learn when we come into kindergarten? I hope by the end of it, actually, I don't know if this has ever happened in your church or your Christian gathering. Have you ever seen people run away excited, ecstatic, exuberant because, Leviticus is a wonderful book? Well, I haven't, sadly. And it's tragic, because Leviticus is an astounding book. Actually, do you know, in the Hebrew Bible, it's not called Leviticus. About 2 centuries before Jesus, one of the rulers in Egypt, one of the Ptolemies, commissioned a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's still around. It's called the Septuagint. But in it, the Greek translators applied Greek names to Hebrew books. And they came to this book, this part of the Torah, and they said, this is obviously addressed to priests, to Levites. So they called it Luetikon, Leviticus. Do you know in Hebrew, there's a tradition in Hebrew where books are called by the first major word in the title, or in the text, so that the first book becomes Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning. Exodus, do you remember from the last time Exodus in the Hebrew Bible is called Shemot, or names? Because the individual liberation is important in the context of the national. This book, Leviticus, the name immediately thinks this is not relevant to 21st century people. But wait a minute. In the Hebrew Bible, it's called Vayikra. Vayikra. And he said, who's he? God. Because there is more direct speech from God in this book than in any other book of the Bible. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I believe the whole Bible's from God. But a lot of it's mediated through prophets, through poets, through historians, through wise men. But here, you've got direct speech, Vayikra, and he said. You have got the biggest sections of direct speech from God here in quotation marks than anywhere else. I mean, doesn't that alert us to something? This book's important. This book's not an optional extra for eccentric people who want to go very, very, very deep and into some absurdly kind of small little area, technically. No, this is wonderful stuff. Because fundamentally, God has major, major things to teach in this book. Now, it would be very easy to get trapped with detail. So again, we're going to look at the book as a whole. As time goes on, once you've got an entrance to it, then you can explore. Then you can bring out your microscope. But as we come into kindergarten, one of the first things that strikes us, it's as if God's saying, I've got to teach you about something that actually separates us, something that alienates us. Something that creates a division between us. It's called sin. Because you're off the mark. You're not going in the right direction. And that's the very nature of our world. Remember we talked about we're living in the middle of a Game of Thrones. Where all around us, the spirit of our age is the spirit of the Babel builders. That's the spirit of narcissism, the spirit of totalitarianism, of megalomania and of pride. Now, over against that, we want to tap into how God's thinking. And as it were, now this is only an illustration. We're only trying to get our very finite little minds around profound realities. But as it were, into this alien environment, which is in a sense often hostile to God, God says, I'm going to plant a little embassy of my values and my kingdom. Now that's how we see the tent of meeting. Right in the middle of the wilderness, the God who comes down from Sinai says, I'm going to create this place where I will dwell in the midst of a world that's so often rejecting me. In a world that's thinking with values that are very much the antithesis of what I want and what I know is actually best for you. So when you come to look at this structure, now I want you to do this in your imagination. Maybe someday you might, it's not impossible, you could get to Israel, you can do this. You can actually walk into the replica and think that as you come through the perimeter fence and you enter into this well-defined little area, you have moved, as it were, from the profane world into a sacred realm. Now, do you see what's happening? It's as if God is putting down this little space, creating a realm of the sacred, a domain of the holy, an embassy of the kingdom. Is an enclave of ideal reality, of perfection. That's the kindergarten. He'd have us learn as we walk in to this area and the division that exists. So, you see, around this perimeter fence, you've got this, as it were, imaginary line. This is my domain, but I'm going to show you how you can enter it. It's as if God's saying, there is a way to me. But listen, the way to me is the way of me. The way to God is the way of God. You don't get to choose it. In my grace, I teach you it. And it's in that teaching he uses that idea that we've already seen is quite offensive sometimes to the human enterprise. One. The one way. The one man. The one faith. See, what we're getting to is to try to see things from God's perspective. We're not coming at this and saying, what's fair to me? What can I take to the United Nations and show this is fair for everybody? No, we're looking at things from a divine. Well, listen, we're not arrogating ourselves. We're not trying to be God, but we're just trying to take tentative steps, entering into that mind that is so alien to us. But if we understand it, remember, his intention from the beginning had been for blessing, for good. It's good. So when we step into this domain, it's the area of the perfection. It's the area that represents life rather than death. That's why God says, if you've been mourning, if you have a death in your family, don't be coming in here. Now, is he discriminating against mourners? No, of course not. But what the fundamental truth is, look, you cannot, if you've been in touch with death, which is very much part of the reality of everyday life here, but that is nothing. That is not part of life that I represent. It's not that he's coming down kind of mercilessly on the grieving, but he's saying, I want to show you on my domain there is life. So when we read in Leviticus that those with bodily imperfections, those with handicaps, are not to come in, or they're not to bring animals that have imperfections, is God discriminating? No, that's not the point here. We're not coming at this with kind of modern PC minds. The fundamental truth that God is teaching is not discriminating against that which is kind of imperfect. He's saying, I want you to enjoy the perfection of my domain. I want to show you when really my plan is complete. It's perfection. It's consummate reality. I'm not trying to discriminate or handicap anybody. Do you see this? It's as if in this kindergarten you've got this ever-present spatial model. That's what Leviticus is really about, the building of the tabernacle. In this world that's so alien from God, he's saying, where I dwell, there is life, there is light. There is nothing that falls far short of perfection. See, this is what he's saying. This is what he's teaching. He's teaching about himself. And we're saying, well, goodness sake, how could any of us ever achieve that? How can any human? Well, you see, if sin, by its very nature, creates alienation, if sin drives a wedge and separates, one of the other fundamental lessons of Leviticus is, do you see in my kindergarten, there's access. I'm going to teach you that there is a way that allows you to come into my presence. There is access. There is a way. Now again, I'm not trying to be kind of unfair about this, but it's as if, the Lord says, listen, you don't choose it. Humanly, you have an innate capacity to make a mess of things. Oh, I know you mean so well, but oh goodness, you can really mess things up. I'm going to show you there is a way. There's a way into my presence. And you're going to learn that there is one man who's actually very fundamental. Whether you're standing in the ancient tabernacle in the middle of the wilderness, or you're standing in a 21st century city, there is one man who's pivotal to this access to the presence of God. And he's the great high priest. Back in the kindergarten, there was a series of very, very human priests who acted as mediators between God and man. But then when you come to the New Testament, when you come to the revelation of Jesus in the Gospels, you find in a New Testament book called Hebrews, this Jesus is the ultimate great high priest. He is the ultimate one who has taken from among his people, who has solidarity with his people. But in the early days, when we were back in kindergarten, that high priest, yes, he was a high priest, but, he was basically, a sinner like any of the rest of us, and he had to offer up offerings for his own sins. But there's a great high priest. And when you listen particularly to the New Testament book of Hebrews, a great high priest, who's been one of us, tested in every way as we are. But then, did you get the next little bit? Yet without sin. He's the ultimate and the perfect high priest. See, we're thinking about how we can read the Bible. Please never think that the Bible is just the domain of an academic or a professional theologian or some professional clergyman. All of us have the privilege and the joy and the challenge of reading this book for ourselves. And I'm going to suggest to you that as you read it, I've already introduced you to thinking with two hands. We've already talked about our bifocals. You also need stereo. Isn't sound much better when you listen in stereo? And the Bible is much richer when you listen in stereo. Now, what do I mean by listening in stereo? I mean that we take seriously the voice of the Hebrew Bible, everything from Genesis through to Malachi. and also the voice coming from Matthew through to Revelation. That we, as it were, live between these two speakers, and it's when we listen to them both, oh, the richness, the sound, the depth of the sound that comes through is so much more profound. Because as we're beginning, listen, even think a little bit up to now, we have met the Creator God, whose word was so powerful. In the New Testament, the word becomes flesh in Jesus. We have met Moses, the mighty man of God, who was the deliverer from Pharaoh's bondage. We meet Jesus, a greater than Moses, who would liberate his people. We have met Abraham, through whom a blessing was promised to the nations. In Jesus, we meet the one through whom that blessing comes. You cannot conceivably separate these testaments. If you think you can just stand on the New Testament alone, as it were, it's a bit like saying, I can build a house and I do not need a foundation. Let me show you a river that has no source. Or, I've been given 2 legs, but I'm not going to walk on 2 legs. I'm going to spend my life hopping. It's absurd. Of course it's absurd. And it's no less absurd for people to say, I'm just a New Testament believer. Basically, we've got to hear the whole Word of God. Because it's one God from beginning to end. And at no stage was Jesus or Paul ever kind of deprecatory. Were they ever derogatory about the Hebrew Bible? Listen in stereo. God speaks to us, and there's a richness to what he says. So as we're listening, you see, we go back and see this tent in the midst of a community, the one people of God's choice, this one people chosen out of humanity, and into the midst of it God comes, and in this home he's creating the possibility of access, of intimacy, because he is showing how he deals with sin. And I think there's an awful lot of truth when we begin to realize the place, the centrality of the Torah in all of this. And this is where I believe, as a Christian, I believe we've still so much to learn from the Jewish perspective. As I say, I'm not talking about modern Zionist politics. I'm talking about a God who has chosen a Hebraic worldview, a Hebraic language to communicate truth in. And that's why when you listen to a former chief rabbi of Britain, where he says, God asks, now listen to this, isn't this so profound? God asks one individual, eventually a family, a tribe, a collection of tribes, a nation, to serve as an exemplary role model, to be as a living case study in what it is to live closely and continuously in the presence of God. Did they perfect that? No, you and I know they didn't. Because the story of the entire Bible is the story of their stubbornness, their unfaithfulness at times. But God was to send a true Israel. Because if the one people as a nation had shortcomings, the one ultimate man of his choice was to perfectly obey the ultimate great high priest. So sin and access, and then, you wouldn't in any way be fair to the book of Leviticus if you didn't deal with the subject of holiness. I think it's sad that this term has become so abused, so stereotyped, so caricatured. Very, very tragic. Because it's one of the richest terms in the Bible. Because God is a God of holiness. And he wanted a people who would be a holy people. A people who, on the face of the earth, would stand out in the crowd. Why? Because they were better, bigger, richer, more powerful? No. Because they were his people. Because they were to live life as he had intended. This is the very nature of holiness. Think of how this term is used today. What does it mean to be holy today? Oh my, that would be an interesting study for you today. To gather a whole series of definitions. To be holy, oh, I've got to paint my face and put my hair up, and I've got to wear different clothes. Oh, to be holy, I've got to be an ascetic. I've got to deny my body. I've got to live like a hermit on a hilltop. Many have tried to be holy, and some of the most extreme, and were it not for their sincerity, they would honestly be just absurdly silly expressions of what holiness is. We've got to see that holiness is not about ascetic lifestyles. It's not about becoming celibate. It's not about becoming heroes and heroines. It's not about, some absurd expression. It's becoming so like God that we actually do stand out in the crowd. And when you look at the history of Israel, and you read it against the background of Leviticus, it's as if God's saying, listen, you are my people. And in the Game of Thrones, the army I am going to work through has to stand out from the crowd, has to be different. So when we look at a lot of these instructions, initially, let's face it, I'm not pretending everything in Leviticus is easy. Of course it's not. But let's back up and see that in its ancient Near Eastern context, God is basically saying, listen, this is how you're going to be different. This is how you're not going to be swallowed up, totally assimilated by the culture around you. This is where you're going to show the world that your lifestyle really is not about death. It's not about falsehood. It's not about imperfection. It's about life and light. This is where God's saying, you're going to be different. You're going to be a holy people. You're not to conform to the world around you. I don't mean you become oddballs and eccentrics. But I mean such is the depth of the quality of your life, your knowledge of God, that the presence of God shines out in your life and you're seen to be different and you live positively. That's why actually in Leviticus, sex is important. It's pretty hard to get away from it today. It's everywhere. Strikingly, in Leviticus, when we see it through its Jewish metrics, sex becomes one of the great litmus tests of the nature of a society. Because where you have a society of sexual immorality, of sexual confusion and distortion, then you've got all sorts of problems. Where you get this kind of basic element in human personality, of human being, sexuality, where this is twisted and distorted, where it becomes a problem. You see, God is not anti-sex. You get a kind of a prudish version of Christianity because it's derived and influenced from kind of Greek dualism that downplays the material and the physical. Therefore, anything to do with sex, could anything to do with such crass physical intimacy be legitimate? Well, actually, yes. As God ordained it, it can be. But as humans, and when we flaunt it, when we turn freedom into pure license, and we disregard responsibility, mutuality, reciprocity, when we disregard true love, then we distort what God was teaching. So we begin to find that this becomes a litmus test. That's why Leviticus actually has so much to say about sexual morality, about sexual behavior. Yes, it's there. There's a courage in this book that you find actually, well, you fail to find in many Christian circles today. The courage to say that as the people of God, we can celebrate within marriage the joy of sexual behavior, sexual intimacy. But where we disregard God's commands and God's structures, we're actually playing with fire. So this is all so very important in the kindergarten. This is why we need to be very careful that we don't behave like so many Christians who, as it were, do you remember when we started off in Genesis? It's as if like a row of dominoes. There's a knock-on effect. But by the time we get to Malachi, most Christians, boom, they put their hands down. And they fail to see that even a book like Leviticus, actually even in terms of behavior patterns, sexual morality, it is very relevant to life in our modern world. This is where we need this big picture. Because on the anvil of Israel as a people, most of the vocabulary that we find in the New Testament, sacrifice, atonement, redemption, priesthood, blood, all the big words of the New Testament, the big words, the heavy hitters, where do you find them? That vocabulary was hammered out in kindergarten, back in Leviticus. So it really pays to increase your word power, deepen your vocabulary by coming back to kindergarten, studying the kindergarten in its historical context. Because I'm not saying we go back to everything Leviticus taught. But in kindergarten, God doesn't give us truths that are useless. So what a place to be. And I hope when you come back to Leviticus and for a little while, what you see, what you can taste, because there's a lot about eating and tasting in Leviticus too. What you can touch, what you can see, what you can handle. It is a veritable sensory delight to come to the kindergarten and then know that in Jesus, what a privilege it is to know we're part of the postgraduate school where we can take these fundamental truths and explore them to such depth. The richness is just phenomenal. Kindergarten, savor it. Don't rush through it, because we have so much to learn. You can join us again, I hope. We're going up to Jerusalem. Oh, it's always exciting to go up to Jerusalem. See you there.